Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Luke Munn, author of Automation as a Myth, published by Stanford University Press, released just about a week ago. Luke is a media studies scholar in New Zealand. His previous books are Unmaking the Algorithm and The Logic of Feeling. Luke's work has been published in a number of scholarly journals, as well as beyond academia and in our press, The Guardian, Washington Post, others. For some of you out there, automation is the holy grail of the future, just like reading popular science or popular mechanics when I was a kid, with flying cars, brain implants, housekeeping, and valet robots. More recently, we anticipate a labor-free world where we are free to pursue dreams of intellectual pursuits, skiing, auditing university courses, or just living the uber-rich life of fulfilling whatever hedonistic urges we may have. For others of us, automation is a foreboding omen of a really big disaster waiting to happen. AI is monitoring our every move, jobs taken away from us, and the disenfranchised becoming more disenfranchised. Either way you go, Luke is here to dispel the three myths of automation that he posits. One, the myth of full autonomy will become the flotsam and jetsam of our world. Two, the myth of universal automation, this non-contextual force that sweeps the globe, essentially our universe. And three, the myth of automating all of us, that is, we are essentially the heart of the automatons surrounding and pervading our very lives and souls. Scary, huh? Well, whatever side you come down on, automation as a myth will have you ruminating and discussing with your friends around town, or hopefully at our bookshop in our book club. Welcome, Luke, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Kia ora koto katoa from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Great to be on the show and talk to all your listeners.
I'm glad you said where you were from, because I spent a lot of time trying to pronounce it and just ended up saying New Zealand.
Okay.
All right. Well, so I like automation. What's wrong with me?
You like automation. What's wrong with automation, right? What's wrong with doing things more efficiently and taking away, the hard labor? I guess, one of the things that the book looks at is that, it's a really enticing promise, right? It's a really kind of this dream of automating work and having it disappear is something that's very kind of alluring. It really has a lot of power in terms of a narrative, a vision. And so it's something that, we can look at, we go back to for a century, looking through the 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. We see this kind of promise keep recurring and keep coming up that automation is almost upon us. It's right around the corner. Soon all work will be taken over by technical systems, by machines. And in fact, the only problem will be, what do we do with all our free time? Or what happens to the human when that kind of core part of their identity, work, disappears, right? What do we do with ourselves then? So it's really interesting to kind of see how this really powerful dream has been around for a long time, and you can certainly understand why it's so compelling for so many people.
Right. Well, so let's go through the myths. And, and you use the word myth, which has kind of a resonant meaning, like the legend of or myth of King Arthur or Greek or Norse mythology. You could have said automation is a hoax, automation is a lie, automation is bad, but you chose myth. How come you chose that word?
Yeah, so the idea here is that automation is not just a myth because it's untrue, but because it's a kind of a grand narrative, right? This automation in all caps, I call it. And that narrative that we see in newspapers and, tech journalism and all of that, again, is a really powerful one and quite a compelling one, but it's one that obscures really a lot of the things that are happening on the ground in terms of actually existing labor conditions, right? And the ways in which technology is really shaping how work works in different places around the world. And so in that sense, it's a myth because it's this sort of, grand narrative that I guess tells a particular story. And that story kind of accentuates things, but also misses out a lot of things. And in that sense, it's a myth that's actually quite unhelpful because it distracts us really from what's actually going on and what we might be paying more attention to.
Well, you make it, simple is the wrong word. You make it convenient and easy for the reader to understand what you're talking about, because as the reviews say, and as the book does, there are 3 sections describing all 3 myths, which makes it easier for our interview today as well. So why don't we go through those seriatim and just see where we end up?
Sure. So we can just step through those. So I've tried to break it down, and the first fiction or myth, as you said, is this fiction of automating everything. And so again, it's this dream that we've had for the last 100 years that machines will soon take over all of those tasks and things that we put under the category of work. They will be automated away, and the human will become superfluous, right? It's like not have anything to do particularly. And again, it's something we see for a long time, and it's this promise that it's just around the corner. And of course, that promise really hasn't come true in the last 100 years. And there are many different reasons for that. One of the key reasons, I think, is just because work itself is really complex, and it's often quite context specific. So one of the rising areas of work right now in the United States as well is personal services. So caring for kids, looking after your dog, elderly care. And these kinds of tasks are very context specific, right? You're working with one person or animal. You need to develop a relationship with them. It's not just kind of physical gestures, it's also this sort of affective or emotional labor. And so it's very specific to a particular person or situation. And those kinds of tasks, technical systems really struggle with and struggle to really understand that kind of contextual nature of labor. And so work, when you think about it, is this really huge constellation of different gestures and skills and roles that we take on, and that humans juggle quite well in many different ways. And all of those prove quite difficult or sort of non-trivial from a technical perspective to just take up, right? Technical systems are very good at tasks that are quite regimented, they're standardized. You expect the same thing every time, and you treat it the same way every time, and often struggle with things that come outside of those parameters. And so, there's this kind of this never-ending promise that automation is just around the corner, and that promise has not come true. And in fact, in recent years, what you see is this kind of revision or clawing back of the promise, where companies are now saying, automating humans away is no longer our goal. What we're trying to do now is to try to understand how humans and machines can work side by side. You look at the literature, and there's this, in the recent years, this notion of human-centered automation or human-augmented automation has come up, where scholars are really trying to understand the best ways in which humans and technical systems might collaborate, in ways in which the don't injure workers for starters in terms of safety, but also, in ways in which they might complement each other or augment each other in ways that kind of make the work conditions good for the human worker as well. And that's something that's quite tricky. So I look at that. We also look at the ways in which, humans are still around in so-called automated systems. We look at content moderation, for example, and of platforms. And you can see when we dig into those systems, for example, content moderation is done for Facebook, for example, and other social media platforms, which is a huge problem, right? And a lot of that work really is outsourced to third parties who use a lot of global south labor, right? So people who are paid, very low wages, or, in the case of Mechanical Turk, these kind of like crowdsourcing automated platforms where, workers bid for certain tasks, these sort of micro tasks that they do, and then are paid cents for each of those micro tasks. And a lot of technical companies use these kind of crowdsourced labor to clean data or to do moderation, to kind of make a lot of their systems work, right? And so one of the key arguments in that section is just that there's actually a huge amount of human labor behind supposedly automated systems. And in fact, automation in many respects is used to kind of cover over the labor conditions that a lot of these people are experiencing, which is often kind of quite precarious or exploitative.
Well, first of all, note, whenever I'm looking down, I'm taking notes. I'm not bored. Everyone knows that.
Okay.
So if you go back to, here's where I think if someone looks at the book, sees, oh, can you hold it up so we can sell it? Do you have it?
Yes, right here.
Okay. And I always do this because, as a bookseller, people judge books by their cover. And that yellow is a great color to
it stands out on the shelf,
yeah,
hopefully.
It's like kind of a magpie thing. But here's the thing. So if someone looks at that cover and goes, oh, no, it's not a myth. And then they go back to the past. You go back to like Elias Howe, the sewing machine. You go back to the seed drill. Go back to Henry Ford and the assembly line. Those all were it's progress. That's the other word, progress. But it did either eliminate a job or make the job more, people no longer had to go one by one planting seeds. It just drilled them in a long furrow. So what about that? What about the sewing machine? That's automation.
Yeah. No, I mean, so the book, the book argues basically not that automated technologies don't exist or they haven't made any significant impacts on labor. That's not really the argument. The argument is kind of, as I said, that in this particular case, this idea that automation will overtake all of work and the human labor will be kind of rendered superfluous is just not happening. And instead we have this kind of weird, really kind of strange half, it's not a utopia or a dystopia, it's kind of more of a purgatory in some ways, this kind of half automated spaces where humans must kind of prop up so-called automated systems and sort of fill in the gaps where they don't work. I mean, in the last chapter in the book before the conclusion, we look at machines in the home, so things like the sewing machine and other kind of domestic automation. And in particular, the way I use a lot of feminist scholars there to think about work and what counts as work, really. Because what you see is that work is generally defined as kind of paid work in a workplace, an office, etc. And work in the home, care work, and all the work that goes into, raising children and carrying out a home does not count as work. And that means that certain spaces. Yeah, the home itself is kind of being overlooked in many ways by automated technologies. And the devices that have entered the home have like helped with labor in some particular ways, but also introduced new expectations, right? So that, you know, these feminist scholars talk about things like the washing machine or new devices in the kitchen, for example, and they do, you know, when they get introduced, in certain ways, you look at the time spent on those tasks and they don't go down, which is strange, right? But what their point is that when new machines get introduced into the home, you have a new set of expectations. So suddenly it's not enough just to do laundry once every 2 weeks, right? The family expects to have new outfits every few days, or it's not enough to cook the same thing every day, right? You need to have this kind of new menu of different healthy eating choices. So kind of new expectations placed normally on the woman in the household, right? And so the point is just that the machine isn't by itself, right? It comes along with this whole set of kind of expectations around it.
You know, it's funny. I kind of want to keep playing devil's advocate because it makes for a good interview. But, you know, yes, I was thinking the washing machine, I was thinking the dishwasher, and you're right. I just did my laundry and I just washed my dishes and I realized, yeah, it saves time, but in some senses, as you posit, I am working for the machine. The worst one is my new coffee machine, which is a very self-righteous, indulgent machine. And it's constantly telling me what I'm doing wrong. The water tank is misplaced. I need to calibrate. I need to empty the grounds. And then it makes all these noises all the time. And I'm working for it. So that's the first time I actually really totally 100% agree with you, because I hate that thing.
Yeah, you get the patronizing error messages. It's pretty funny.
But the noises, it's almost as if, I think at one time they invented a hairdryer that didn't make any noise, and they had to remodify it so it did make noise because people didn't trust one that didn't make noise.
Right. Yeah, it's funny the expectations we have around technologies and what they should, you know, act like and how we should. Yeah, there's kind of like mutual shaping, right? Is something that scholars have talked about too, where we, you know, we have technologies. I've looked at Alexa, for example, you know, the intelligent assistant from Amazon, and the ways in which people really recalibrate the way that they talk and really have to learn this language of Alexa, right? In order to effectively work with the machine. And so it's not just the fact that we're sort of command these technologies, we actually have to kind of adjust ourselves, accommodate ourselves to the ways in which they work and the processes they use.
Well, that's an excellent example with Alexa, because you can switch to Google, and me, you, but especially kids are developing kind of what I call an auxiliary brain. So I've had children at the bookstore say, why do I need to learn this? I can just ask Google. I can just, and the thing is that all you're required to do is pose the proper query. If you can pose the proper query, you are really ahead of the curve right now.
Yeah.
But you're being shaped, as you say, by Google's constraints. But still, it's really helpful to know. You don't have to know when the Magna Carta was signed anymore in school.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, then you go to, the book is really well footnoted too, which is helpful. And you can go to the footnotes and then you can go down the rabbit hole with Google.
Yeah, I mean, one of the audiences in mind is kind of college students for this. It's quite an easy read in some ways. It's sort of short for a monograph, but it's got this kind of provocative, argument, and then it gives a lot of reading links. So if you're interested in, history of automation or history in sort of feminist takes on automation or, any particular topic, you can kind of dive into that rabbit hole pretty easily.
It's really funny. If you type automation is a myth in Google, there's a copious amount of material with those exact words. And one
Yeah,
that,
right.
yeah, one that's really interesting is Forbes magazine had an article 6 months ago, and they talked about the myths. Basically, they did say myths, but they're basically misperceptions. So, and I'll just go through it real quickly, indulge me. They're saying people think automation is expensive, and they explain why it's not. Automation is tough. They explain why it's not. Automation and AI are the same thing. They say it's not. Automation will make most job roles redundant. They say no. They say we'll lose control over regulatory tasks. They say no. And so then I thought, okay, well, you seem certain in your book. It seems like you really believe exactly what you're saying. I'm not saying you're being condescending for those who feel otherwise, but you do, just as the Forbes article is. So here's two. I read both of them.
Who's the Forbes article written by?
I don't know. I just took. I can send. I'll send you the article. But the point is, what's Forbes magazine? It's a capitalist tool. And but my point is, I'm your reader, but I also read Forbes. So I read both your book and Forbes. How do I determine who's right? I'm not saying there's no intersection between the two.
Yeah.
I'm simply saying they're saying automation is a positive thing for society. You're saying apparently that it seems to be in good part negative, whether it's because of women's roles, minority roles, or simply because it's not good.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope to not just kind of, I would hope that the book isn't just a kind of automation bad right argument, but there's certainly kind of racialized and gendered elements to how automation plays out, which kind of I tackle in the second half of the book. But I think one of the key arguments of the book is really just that automated technologies do shape labor in particular ways, and we need to pay attention to how that plays out. And the ways in which automation is conjured up in mainstream press and a lot of journalism and so much is not helpful in doing that. And so I zoom into particular locations where automated technologies are playing out, like Amazon warehouses, for example, and talk about the particular conditions that that workers are undergoing there. And yeah, I guess there's definitely disadvantages and ways in which automated technologies are used in negative ways. But I think the broader point here is to kind of give us better tools and better approaches, better lens maybe, is a nice way of putting it, to actually dig into the ways in which automated tech is reshaping labor. And then we can have the discussion, right, about whether it's good or bad. It's impossible to have that discussion when you're talking about automation from this kind of 10,000 foot view, which is, GDP, technology will do this and this, 10,000 jobs will be, gone. We really need to zoom into particular places and spaces and think about it in quite specific ways to actually have this discussion about, okay, well, am I working more or less hours? Is my wage up or down? Is my metrics, the kind of my work rate, is that going up or down? How does this really change what I'm doing? I think that's the more helpful conversations to be having.
Well, to continue to come at you. So you look at, you said 10,000 foot view. So look at GPS satellites. I don't have to write down directions. There's no way I'd ever find the damn place. But now I can go anywhere I want to, find it instantly. I don't know whether that's automation or not. Autonomous vehicles. I listened to a professor from Penn saying there will never be an autonomous vehicle. There are simply too many variables. But then at the same time, if you're texting while you're driving, there's no driver at all. So they say texting while driving is worse than driving while drunk. But anyway, both of those could lead into the evil emperor Elon Musk, who, you know, he's in your book and mostly negative. But yeah, here's where we seem to have our divide, is that I'm saying, okay, and I may be just misunderstanding, but if I'm saying GPSs are great, and if I'm saying that a semi-autonomous vehicle is great, why am I wrong? Am I wrong? Or are we having our discussion? You know, what is?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if GPS would be considered example of automation, maybe not. I mean, the autonomous vehicle thing, I don't really go into too much in the book. You know, I think it's worth noting here that, you know, Uber had their self-driving pilot program on for a few years, and then it's largely abandoned that, I believe, after they've had a couple crashes. Yeah, I mean, whether or not we'll reach autonomous vehicles is really difficult to say. I think they could be helpful for some people. But, you know, also autonomous vehicles are kind of our cars, and there's a contradiction, I guess, between like public transport and the ways in which it gets a lot of people around for cheap prices usually, and the personal motor vehicle. But that's not really, you know, something I talk about too much in the book. I think, yeah, I guess I would hope that the book goes beyond kind of good and evil, and maybe just has us think more about the ways in which we can have this discussion about automation.
Yeah, I agree, it does, but some of your footnotes do talk about Elon Musk, his workplace. Plus, he's in the news today attempting to buy Twitter, and who knows whether he really wants to buy it, or whether he's just trying to make money, or if he's just joking around. But those things aside, if you, notwithstanding what you think of him, my brother thinks he's a jackass, but he has a Tesla. But so if you take SpaceX, if you take Tesla, if you take the battery thing, if you take Boring Company, if you take AI, if you take the GPS, hey, he's done all these things. And if what your footnotes basically say is that the workplace, actually he was just fined $15 million for racial discrimination. But yeah, if that's what you're coming at, yeah, I buy that completely. But that doesn't obviate the fact that these things that he's done seem to me to be progress, and seem to me to be something we would want. I have a problem here, and the problem is simply that I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, it's like, oh, to put it as simply as possible, okay, there's cars instead of horses, so it's better to have cars. That's it. That's all. That's what's going through my head.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And I'm wrong. I know I'm wrong, but you got to tell me why I'm wrong. I mean,
well, I mean, what's progress? You know,
I don't know I don't know. What is it? You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because technology and progress have really been interlinked and deeply connected for a long time, right?
Good.
And so technology is seen as this kind of linear history where things are getting better all the time. And we move from one technology to the next, and it's more advanced, it's more efficient, which of course is seen as a good thing. This is kind of assumption, right? And in fact, technology, the kind of discourse around technology, the rhetoric is that, you know, you look back on technologies from 3 or 4 or 10 years ago, and they're seen as laughable, right? It's very crude. You know, like it's crazy how far we've come since then, and look at how silly these kind of and crude these former technologies are, and how advanced we are now. And so technology and progress have this kind of deep connection. And yeah, and I guess there's a lot of scholars, a lot of people that kind of question, you know, what that connection is, and whether certain advancements are progress. You know, we could talk about GPS in the car, but we could also talk about, you know, surveillance systems and how far they've come and how far they've progressed, you know, in terms of becoming more advanced. Look at platforms and the amount of data that's captured, highly sophisticated kind of algorithms, machine learning systems. You know, that's progress from a technical perspective. Doing things more efficiently, with less compute power, at scale. That's progress. And particularly in computer science, it's seen as progress. And also, I think in mainstream, kind of the popular understanding, that's progress. But when we turn to like a particular use case like surveillance, then it suddenly becomes a lot more gray, right? You know, is it really progress? And what's the purpose of these things? You know, it's not just enough to be more efficient. I think we need to question what the efficiency is in service of. And so there's certainly like counterexamples to obviously helpful technologies, maybe like GPS.
Yeah, I think you've convinced me to a certain extent, because I was just thinking about, you know, the old acetate records, then vinyl records, then CDs, or no, then cassette tape, then CDs, and now just streaming. And again, it has nothing to do with automation, but you're right. It has to do with progress. It has to do with technology. But then the gray area that you posit is like London or Beijing, where CCTV is everywhere. There was a guy who went, you know, he did an experiment and went to the police department in Beijing and said, let's see how long it takes for you to find me. And he just took off. And they found him like in 1 minute. You know, he gave him a head start. They gave him a head start and they found him in like 1 minute. So is that good or bad? I mean, it prevents crime theoretically. It memorializes what's going on in the situation where there's a car crash and someone sues the other person. So that's, well, no, am I wrong? That's not automation, is it? Or is it?
Yeah, so like in the book, I actually look at automated surveillance in China as one of the examples, which is automated and not automated. If you dig into that chapter, there's a huge amount of police, like you said, that have to support the system. Tens of thousands of people that, you know, have to go into people's homes, go into their places of business and interview them, and then log all that data on phones. So there's this kind of mixing, right, of human and machine labor to set up this automation, this surveillance regime there. But yeah, it certainly provides a kind of example of something that's highly sophisticated. You know, China is seen as having one of the most kind of pervasive, extensive surveillance systems in the world. And that's, you know, from a technical standpoint, it's hugely complex and sophisticated, but, you know, it kind of begs the question of like, for what end?
Well, if we go back through your myths, the third one, the myth of automating all of us, that's kind of like what I was saying about the coffee machine, is that we would be, and I understand we would be working, rather than having leisure, we would be essentially working full time for these guys, you know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a case, you know, this idea that, I mean, you go back to the 30s, right? And like I said, the promise was that automation is coming soon. This is Keynes' argument, right? That automation will replace all work. And so in that case, then we can go down to this kind of 2 or 3 day working week, right? With all this leisure time. And in fact, that hasn't been the case. You see productivity levels have risen since the 70s, but wages haven't. They've kind of stagnated. And so rather than kind of using technologies to kind of provide us with this leisure and enjoyment and free time, actually we've ended up working more in many cases, and working, for more precarious conditions. So yeah, there's definitely this kind of strange, or not so strange, I guess, if you look at it from a capital perspective, this progression where we're producing more, productivity is way up, but working hours have risen, if anything.
Hey, did you ever read Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut?
Yeah, I've read some of that. Yep.
Yeah, and that kind of mirrors exactly what you're talking about. In the beginning, there's this guy driving down the road, and there's these other guys that are just standing around because they've lost their jobs, and his car breaks down, and they all pounce on the car because they realize they can fix it. They know how to fix it, and they can go back to where they were. One takes a piece of felt from his hat and creates a gasket and fix it. Now you can't fix your car. You open the hood of your car, there's nothing to see.
Yeah.
In the old days, you could have fixed it, but automation has created this box. Well, yeah, you know what? There's a lot of black boxes, aren't there?
Yeah, it's definitely true. And that's something that I've been looking at as maybe a kind of next project, is thinking about so-called smart technology versus, and thinking about dumb technology as a kind of provocative counterexample, which you could actually, take apart, understand, fix yourself. This right to repair movement, has been quite growing in the United States. And for example, when you look at, tractors, farmers who have been locked out of their own tractors and can't make changes to them without paying John Deere, huge fees to have a mechanic come out. And so this sort of, hacking of their own systems and workarounds to actually be able to service their own tractors. It's kind of crazy.
I know. It's like when HP got sued because, which is, I hate it, when your printer, one cartridge ran out, the printer stopped working, even though the other 3 had plenty of ink in them, and they got sued for that. But yeah, that's very true. So so that sounds like a really interesting project. But so how did you get interested in this stuff when you were a kid? When did you first realize that this is the area that you work in is something that you really wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I've got kind of a strange history. I actually did a design for my bachelor's, so my university degree, and then worked for a while doing kind of web design development work in different places. And then kind of started doing kind of new media art. So working with technology, and I went to Berlin for a while, did some sound art and media art there. And then, and then kind of came back and actually did this sort of Masters of Creative Technologies here in Auckland, which was a way of sort of working creatively with different technologies and also thinking about how they might work differently. And that led in pretty naturally, really, to the PhD that I went into in Australia. So I worked under a supervisor there that works a lot with media studies. And we looked at kind of algorithmic power and looked at these Uber and Airbnb and these kind of very powerful platforms and the way that they shape work, but also kind of everyday life for a lot of people. So that was the PhD thesis, and then kind of progressed from there and sort of basically working in this kind of digital cultures, media studies area, where I look across a lot of things actually, but you know, automation, AI is one of those. And yeah, it just became a really interesting, I actually wrote an essay for this around automation as a myth, and then
Oh yeah,
it really just had legs, you know, it kind of figured this could easily be a book, so sort of progressed from there.
Well, since you know, basically we're talking about your life surrounding media. So if you go back like me, being dilettantish and, you know, having a breadth of knowledge, but little depth. So if we go back to say Marshall McLuhan, which is kind of like, I don't know, the fountainhead of this. So if you, and this is not selling your book, but I'm interested in it. So that's the only thing I know really about media studies, the concept that context is actually created by the media, not the information that it conveys.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Just give me a couple paragraphs about that.
Yeah, no, media's message. I mean, so McLuhan's argument there is basically that the ways or the kind of means, yeah, the media itself, the kind of ways in which we transmit it and package it, right, and have it available to people actually shapes the way in which we consume it, right? So we have the same story, which might be in a newspaper, 200 words, text on paper, and that's a certain kind of package for an idea. But when you transmit it, you know, the same thing with television, you have a different set of codes around that, where the news presenter, talking heads, a certain kind of legitimacy or authority, right, with a news broadcaster. And then, you know, the actual transmission itself, where you're receiving a television signal at certain frames per second. And all of that kind of shapes the way in which we, yeah, understand these ideas and perceive them and take them on board. And so media themselves kind of influence the ideas and are quite significant.
Yeah, in America, essentially the alt-right and the alt-left are created by the media, whether it's Sean Hannity or Anderson Cooper. They shape, and worst of all, Tucker Carlson. You know, just this person who, in my opinion, but like my brother always said, I said to my brother, why does this shit happen? And he goes, because there's half the people that think this, and there's half the people that think this. And it was a very profound, but simply put thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example too, because, you know, Tucker Carlson and his kind of talk show hosts are very much leveraging outrage, right, in order to drive their audience, in exactly the same way that radical right on platforms leverage outrage to get clicks and likes and retweets and so on, right? And this kind of and the messages, you know, scholars have shown that the messages that get retweeted and shared the most and the fastest are the ones that have this kind of really toxic, outrageous content in them. And it doesn't matter if they're true. And in fact, like the falsities, they say, you know, get shared much faster and further than true statements, right? So that's a very good example, I think, of the ways in which you can kind of leverage a medium to kind of amplify a certain message and to really gamify it, really. These are the mechanisms that work. And so this is the way we're going to lean into that and leverage that for polarization, really.
Yeah, I know. It's like, you know, with a lever long enough, you can rule the world. Leverage is a great word to be using in this, because now that I think about it and talking about whether it's Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity or Anderson Cooper or Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the way they leverage is a small amount of information can yield incredible results, just like financing a building where you put 10% down and you get 80% financing. It's exactly the same thing. Yeah. And that makes me understand I think that I understand that. And I bet you if I read the Unmaking of Algorithm and Logic of Feeling, which I'm going to do, I would understand it even more. Well, actually, that's a good place to conclude. So before we end, just give us a little bit more since we started it, a little bit more of what your next project will be, so people can be anticipating that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm like I said, I actually work across a lot of different. So I actually do some work on the radical right and the ways in which they've used digital networks, which is, a pretty urgent kind of issue right now.
We've got a lot of urgent issues right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think I've been looking at AI as a kind of a next topic, and the ways in which AI might be rethought. Yeah, AI also in a similar way, I think, to automation, it comes with a lot of assumptions and a particular worldview about what matters, what our priorities should be, and what technology should be doing. And it's a hugely pervasive kind of set of technologies that are being rolled out across, energy, but also military, welfare systems, employment contracts, and so on. And so I think that's going to be a really significant topic, and finding ways to kind of rethink those to make them more equitable, communal, egalitarian, these kind of things, I think will be hugely important in the next few years.
I agree. Well, thanks, Luke. And we've been talking to Luke Munn, author of Automation is a Myth, published by Stanford. And like I said, released just about a week ago. It's already on our front table. And I think it's good for, especially because of the more, it sounds like I'm bragging, but the more sophisticated customers we have. This is the kind of thing they're looking for, and they probably won't be able to find it in a lot of other places. And so I'm really pleased to talk to you. Thank you so much for doing this, and maybe we'll be back in touch when the new book comes out.
All right, thanks for having me.
Yep, my pleasure.
See ya.